Welcome to Top 10 Emotional Comeback. My son was slipping away right before my eyes, fading like a ghost in our family home, and everyone thought I was losing my mind. Then my 12-year-old grandson pressed a crumpled piece of paper into my palm during Sunday dinner, and what I found that night made me scream until my throat was raw. If you've ever known in your bones that someone you love was in terrible danger, stay with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Richard Blackwell. I'm 74 years old, and for 4 decades, I worked as a chemical engineer and toxicologist for one of the largest pharmaceutical corporations in this country. I spent my entire career hunting invisible threats, identifying poisons that hide in plain sight. But somehow, I missed the deadliest toxin of all, the one being fed in my own flesh and blood every single day. The sound of that silver spoon hitting the porcelain bowl, it still haunts me. I can hear it echoing in my nightmares. I watched my son Marcus struggle just to lift his hand, watched his fingers shake so violently that the soup splattered across that pristine white tablecloth his wife insisted we use for family dinners. Marcus is only 46 years old. 6 months ago, he was running a software empire, preparing for an IPO that would have made him one of the wealthiest men in Seattle. This was a man who could deadlift 200 pounds at the gym, who ran marathons for charity, who had more energy than men half his age. Now he looked like death itself had already claimed him. His skin hung gray and lifeless on his bones. His eyes were sunken so deep into his skull they looked like black holes. And when he tried to focus on my face, I could see nothing but confusion swimming in those hollow depths. "Here, sweetheart, let me help you with that." Victoria's voice dripped like honey, sweet and thick and suffocating. My daughter-in-law is 38, a former registered nurse with a smile that makes my skin crawl. She reached across the table and took the spoon from Marcus's trembling hand, wiping his chin like he was a helpless child who couldn't feed himself. I saw Marcus flinch when she touched him. Just a tiny movement, barely visible, but I caught it. That split-second expression of pure fear that vanished as quickly as it appeared. After 40 years of examining evidence under microscopes, I know what terror looks like, even when someone tries to hide it. I cleared my throat, trying to keep my voice steady even though rage was building in my chest like a volcano about to erupt. "Has Dr. Morrison run a complete heavy metal screening yet, Victoria? Or rechecked his liver function? His skin has this yellowish tint that concerns me deeply. It looks like jaundice, or maybe something systemic attacking his organs." Victoria didn't even glance in my direction. She kept her focus on the bowl of soup she was cooling, blowing on it gently like the devoted wife everyone believed her to be. "Richard, please. We've been over this already. Dr. Morrison has confirmed it a rare autoimmune disorder, made worse by stress. You asking him 1,000 medical questions every time you visit only makes his blood pressure spike. The doctor specifically said no discussion of test results or medical charts during meals. We want Marcus to relax and focus on healing." Relax. My son looked like he was disappearing from this world, evaporating like water on hot pavement, and she wanted him to relax. Marcus was slumped in his chair, his head tilting to one side, like his neck couldn't support the weight anymore. This brilliant man who used to argue philosophy and politics with me until 2 a.m, who built a technology company from absolutely nothing. Now he could barely keep his eyes open long enough to acknowledge I was sitting across from him. I gripped my fork, so hard my knuckles turned bone white. "I'm just saying, Victoria, autoimmune diseases don't typically cause this kind of rapid neurological deterioration in just a few weeks. I'd like to review his most recent lab work myself. As his father and someone with expertise in toxicology, I might notice something a general practitioner would miss." Victoria finally looked directly at me, and the expression on her face, oh God, it was pure calculation hidden behind a mask of concern. "You've been retired for 10 years, Richard. Medical science has evolved significantly since then. Besides, you were too busy gallivanting through Europe and Southeast Asia for the past year to notice when his symptoms actually began. I've been here every single day, caring for him around the clock, changing his bedding when he's too weak to move, managing every single medication. I think I understand what my husband needs better than anyone. That blow landed exactly where she intended. She was absolutely right. I had been traveling. I'd taken my retirement savings and tried to see the world, assuming my successful son was perfectly fine without me hovering. When I returned 2 weeks ago and saw Marcus like this, the guilt nearly crushed me under its weight. Victoria knew precisely where to strike to cause maximum damage. She turned back to Marcus, and her voice transformed instantly from ice cold to sickeningly sweet. Speaking of managing everything, darling, we have wonderful news. Mr. Patterson is coming over this Friday. Since you're struggling so much with daily business decisions, he's prepared all the paperwork to transfer your company voting rights and control of the family trust to me. Just temporarily, of course, until you regain your strength and can handle things again. My blood turned to ice in my veins. The company was weeks away from going public. We were talking about assets worth tens of millions of dollars. And the family trust, that was everything I'd worked my entire life to build. Money I'd set aside for Marcus and my grandson Oliver. I looked at Marcus, expecting him to object, to fight back. He'd always been so fiercely protective of the business he'd built from nothing. But he just blinked slowly, his mouth hanging slightly open, a thin line of drool forming at the corner of his lips. "Okay," he whispered, his voice nothing but dry rasp like dead leaves scraping across concrete. "Whatever you think is best, Vic. I just need to sleep." "You'll sleep very soon, honey," Victoria said, patting his hand with what anyone else would have mistaken for affection. "Just finish your soup first. You need to keep your strength up for Friday's meeting." I looked across the table at my grandson, Oliver. He's 12 years old, incredibly intelligent, loves computer programming just like his father and fishing with me. Usually he's bouncing off the walls with energy, showing me his latest robotics project or asking about my travels. Tonight, he sat frozen in his chair, pushing green peas around his plate in endless circles, his head down, shoulders hunched forward like he was trying to make himself invisible. He looked absolutely terrified. "Oliver," I said, trying desperately to make some kind of connection with him. "How's school treating you, buddy? Are you still working on that robotics competition project?" Oliver didn't look up. He just nodded once, quickly without making a sound. Victoria answered for him, her voice sharp with authority. "Oliver is taking a break from robotics club. He needs to focus on helping me around the house now that his father is so ill. Right, Oliver?" It wasn't a question. It was a command, a threat disguised as a statement. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. Oliver had knocked his heavy silver fork off the table, and it clattered loudly on the hardwood floor. "Sorry," Oliver mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I'll get it." He slipped off his chair and disappeared under the massive oak dining table. I assumed he was just retrieving the fallen utensil, but then I felt something near my feet. A small, cold hand gripped my ankle through my sock. My heart started pounding like a drum against my rib cage. I felt his fingers fumbling frantically with the hem of my pants, shoving something small and paper-like inside my sock, pressing it against my skin. My entire body went rigid. I kept my face completely neutral. Took a casual sip of water, my eyes focused on the crystal chandelier above us, while my grandson passed me a desperate secret message right under his mother's watchful gaze. Oliver emerged a second later, clutching the fork tightly. His face was deathly pale. For just a split second, his eyes locked onto mine, and in that brief moment, I saw a plea for help so powerful it nearly broke my heart into a million pieces. Then he looked down at his plate again, retreating into himself. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she scanned the table suspiciously. "Everything all right down there, Oliver?" "Fine, Mom," he said quietly, just slipped out of my hand. The rest of that dinner passed in agonizing slow motion. I could feel that piece of paper scratching against my ankle like it was burning a hole through my skin. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to get out of that house, to read whatever message Oliver had risked everything to pass me. But I couldn't rush. If Victoria suspected anything, she would cut off my access completely. She'd already limited my visits to once a week, claiming I exhausted Marcus with my presence. I forced myself to finish my meal. I forced myself to make meaningless small talk about the weather and upcoming elections. I watched Victoria spoon-feed my son the rest of that soup, and a terrible, dark suspicion began growing in my mind like a cancer. A suspicion based on 4 decades of understanding how chemicals destroy the human body. The tremors, the confusion, the skin discoloration, the rapid onset of symptoms. This wasn't an autoimmune disorder. This was something else entirely. This was poisoning. As soon as the plates were cleared, I stood up slowly, reaching for my coat. I should head out now. Marcus looks completely exhausted. Victoria walked me to the front door. Outside, a violent storm had begun. Rain lashed against the windows like angry fists, perfectly matching the turmoil raging in my gut. "Don't forget," Victoria said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Friday is an extremely important day. Maybe wait until next week to visit again. We'll be very busy with lawyers and paperwork and signing documents." "I'm sure you will be," I thought bitterly. "I'll call first," I said aloud. "Tell Marcus I love him." I walked out into the pouring rain. I didn't run. I walked at the slow, measured pace of an old man who had accepted his diminished place in the world. I got into my car parked down the street beneath a large maple tree, my hands shaking violently as I reached down and pulled that piece of paper from my sock. It was a page torn from a school notebook. The handwriting was rushed and jagged, written in desperate pencil. I turned on the overhead reading light, and the yellow glow illuminated words that changed everything. "Grandpa, check the storage facility. Dad rented unit 319. The code is Grandma's birthday. You need to see what's inside before Friday. She's going to make him sign everything away. Please hurry." I stared at those words until they blurred in my vision. Oliver knew. My 12-year-old grandson knew something was terribly, horrifically wrong, and he was scared enough to risk passing me this note right under his mother's nose. Unit 319. I knew that storage place. It was a rundown facility on the edge of town near the abandoned industrial district. Marcus had rented a unit there years ago to store old computer equipment from his first startup, but he hadn't used it in forever. Why would Oliver want to go there? And then the date hit me like a freight train. Friday. Victoria was pushing for power of attorney on Friday. Oliver said I had to see what was inside before Friday. The clock was ticking. I looked back at the house through the rain-streaked windshield. The dining room lights had been switched off. I imagined Victoria in there now, perhaps preparing another dose of whatever was slowly killing my son. I gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. I'm 74 years old. I'm supposed to be playing golf and reading mystery novels by the fireplace. But tonight, I felt a surge of adrenaline I hadn't experienced in decades coursing through my veins like liquid fire. I put the car in gear. I wasn't going home to my empty house. I was going to Unit 319. And God help anyone who tried to stop me. I drove through that storm like a man possessed, windshield wipers beating a frantic rhythm against the deluge. My mind raced through every chemical compound I'd ever studied, every poison that could cause Marcus's symptoms. Arsenic, thallium, mercury, each one had its own signature, its own timeline of destruction. If I was right, if Victoria was doing what every fiber of my being told me she was doing, she wasn't just a terrible wife. She was something far worse. She was a cold, calculating killer. The drive to store safe storage felt like traveling to my own funeral. The rain had transformed into a relentless wall of water that hammered the roof of my car, drowning out the engine's hum, but doing nothing to silence the screaming panic in my brain. I'm 74 years old. For God's sake, I should be worried about my cholesterol levels or my golf swing, not breaking into a storage unit in the dead of night to prove my daughter-in-law is systematically murdering my son. The facility sat in an industrial wasteland where streetlights flickered like dying stars and potholes could swallow a tire whole. It was the kind of place where people stored things they couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't bring themselves to destroy. The perfect place to hide a terrible secret. I pulled my car into the shadow of a massive dumpster, away from the main entrance gate. I killed the engine and just sat there for a moment, listening to the rain and the thundering of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. I checked my glove compartment. Flashlight, check. I popped the trunk. Bolt cutters, check. I stepped out into the storm. The cold water soaked through my coat instantly, chilling me straight to my bones. I moved as quickly as my old legs would carry me, keeping low, avoiding the sparse pools of yellow light cast by the security lamps scattered around the property. I punched in the gate code at the keypad. Marcus had used the same one for years. For a terrifying second, nothing happened, and I thought Victoria had changed it. I thought my journey would end right there, locked out at a rusty keypad. But then the motor groaned to life, and the gate began sliding open just wide enough for me to slip through like a ghost. Unit 319 was in the back row, down a dark corridor of identical metal doors that seemed to stretch into infinity. The rain was deafening here, drumming relentlessly against the aluminum roof. When I found the number painted on the door, my flashlight beam shook so badly I could barely read it. The lock on the door wasn't the standard-issue padlock the facility normally provided. It was a heavy-duty, hardened steel disc lock, the kind contractors use to secure expensive equipment or valuable tools. Victoria wasn't taking any chances. She wanted to make absolutely certain no casual observer could peek inside. I pulled the bolt cutters from beneath my soaking coat. They were heavy, a brutal reminder of my days working on-site at chemical plants where sometimes you had to cut through jam valve access panels or emergency locks. I positioned the sharp jaws of the cutter around the thick shackle of the lock. I took a deep breath, bracing my feet against the wet asphalt, and I squeezed with everything I had. My shoulders screamed in protest. My wrists felt like they might snap. For a terrifying moment, the steel refused to yield, and I felt a crushing wave of despair wash over me. I was too old for this. Too weak. Too late. But then I thought of Marcus's face at dinner, the way his eyes rolled back in his head when he tried to focus, and a surge of pure adrenaline flooded my system, giving me the strength I thought I'd lost decades ago. There was a sharp, loud crack that echoed through the night like a gunshot. The lock fell to the wet ground with a metallic clang. I looked around frantically, scanning the darkness for any sign of a security guard or late-night visitor. Nothing, just the endless rain. I bent down and grabbed the handle at the bottom of the rolling door. I heaved it upward with a grunt of effort. The door screeched on its rusty tracks, a sound that set my teeth on edge and made my heart race even faster. I slipped inside and pulled the door down behind me, leaving just a small gap at the bottom for fresh air. I clicked on my flashlight again, and the beam cut through the darkness. The first thing that hit me wasn't visual. It was a smell, a sharp, unmistakable chemical tang that cut straight through the musty odor of damp concrete. It smelled like industrial bleach mixed with something sweeter, something metallic and cloying that made my stomach turn. It was a smell I hadn't encountered in years, not since my days working in the toxicology laboratory. It was the smell of a crime scene that someone had tried desperately to sanitize. I swept the flashlight beam slowly across the space, and what I saw made my blood run cold. This unit wasn't filled with old office furniture or boxes of financial records. It was sparse, clinical, terrifying. In the center of the concrete floor sat a folding plastic table, and on top of it was a precise, methodical arrangement of items that made bile rise in my throat. Boxes of latex gloves, a digital scale accurate to the milligram, a mortar and pestle, and stacked neatly in the corner were 6 large plastic containers labeled Power Max Protein Powder, a generic brand you could buy at any health food store. I walked over to those containers, my footsteps echoing softly in the enclosed space. The safety seals on the lids had been broken, peeled back carefully. I pried one open with trembling hands. Inside was fine white powder that smelled artificially sweet like vanilla, but sitting right on top, barely hidden, was a small plastic measuring scoop and a Ziploc bag containing a different substance entirely, a grayish-white crystalline powder that looked nothing like protein supplement. I carefully opened the small bag and wafted the air toward my nose, a technique I'd learned decades ago in the lab. A distinct, unmistakable scent hit my olfactory nerves like a punch to the face. Bitter almonds. It was faint, heavily masked by the artificial vanilla scent of the protein powder. But it was definitely there. My mind raced through the periodic table, through 40 years of chemical knowledge. Bitter almonds usually indicated cyanide compounds, but cyanide killed fast, within minutes. Marcus was dying slowly, withering away over months. Then I remembered certain heavy metal salts, when processed in specific ways, could mimic that scent or hide themselves within it. Thallium, perhaps a synthesized arsenic compound. These were the poisons of the patient, methodical killer. They were tasteless, nearly odorless to an untrained nose, and they dissolved easily in liquids or food. They destroyed the nervous system first, causing tremors, numbness, confusion. Then they systematically attacked the internal organs. I looked back at the table with growing horror. Next to the scale sat a black leather notebook, the kind you buy at any office supply store. I opened it with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. The handwriting was unmistakable. I'd seen it on birthday cards and grocery lists for over a decade. It was Victoria's elegant, looping script. But now I was seeing it used to document murder. The entries were frighteningly meticulous. They weren't written like the ravings of someone who'd lost their mind. They were clinical, precise, like a nurse's log tracking a patient's vital signs and medication schedule. Week 1, October 6, dosage. 5 milligrams mixed in morning protein shake. Subject reported fatigue and dizziness by early afternoon. Appetite significantly suppressed. Excellent initial response. I flipped through the pages, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Week 2, October 13th. Dosage increased to 10 milligrams. Subject vomited after evening meal. Complained of intense burning sensation in fingertips. Dr. Morrison prescribed antacids. Perfect cover, no suspicion raised. She was documenting his destruction like a scientist running an experiment. She was carefully adjusting the dosage based on his weight loss and the doctor's complete ignorance of what was really happening. Week 4, October 27th. Dosage, 20 milligrams. Subject is now bedridden. Severe leg muscle atrophy observed. Numbness has progressed to both knees. He can no longer drive or walk without assistance. Complete control established. I felt a wave of nausea that had absolutely nothing to do with the chemical smell filling my lungs. Complete control established. That's what this was really about. It wasn't just about inheriting wealth. It was about systematically incapacitating him, breaking him down piece by piece until he was too weak to resist, too confused to question, too dependent to fight back. I turned to the final entry with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. It was dated for this coming Friday. Friday, final phase. Dosage, 50 milligrams administered in evening protein shake. Cardiac arrest anticipated within 4 hours of ingestion. Clean resolution. No autopsy expected due to established autoimmune diagnosis on medical records. I slammed the notebook shut, so hard the sound echoed off the metal walls. 50 milligrams. That was a massive, lethal dose. It would stop his heart like flipping a light switch. She was planning to kill him Friday night, right after he signed over the company and the family trust to her control. I had to get this evidence to the police immediately. I grabbed a bag of gray powder and shoved it carefully into my coat pocket. I tucked the leather notebook into my belt, hiding it under my sweater. This was it. This was the smoking gun, the irrefutable proof. I had the murder weapon and the written confession. I turned toward the door, my hand reaching for the handle to lift it. I needed to get to the police station right now, this very second. But before my fingers could touch the cold metal, the narrow gap at the bottom of the door suddenly blazed with light. Bright, blinding white light flooded underneath, casting long, nightmarish shadows across the concrete floor. The rumble of a vehicle engine purred just outside, low and menacing. It wasn't the rattle of a regular car. It was the heavy, powerful idle of a large SUV. My heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. I froze completely, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then I heard the crunch of boots on wet gravel. Heavy, purposeful footsteps approaching. "Hey, who's in there?" The voice was deep, aggressive, authoritative. This wasn't some sleepy night watchman making his rounds. This was private security, the kind Victoria had hired. I'd seen the invoice on her desk once. Titan Guard security. They weren't shopping mall rent-a-cops. They were ex-military contractors who knew exactly what they were doing. I stepped back away from the door, clutching the evidence against my chest like a shield. The light shifted as the vehicle outside moved closer, directing its high beam straight at the metal door I was hiding behind. "Open the door right now. We saw you on thermal imaging. Open it immediately, or we're cutting through the lock." I looked around desperately. The small metal room felt like it was closing in on me. There was no back exit, no window, no escape route. Just that single rolling door in front of me and 4 metal walls trapping me inside. I'm 74 years old, cornered in a metal box with the only evidence that could save my son's life. And the people paid to protect the woman systematically killing him were standing less than 10 feet away. I gripped the bolt cutters in my hand again, but this time not as a tool, as a weapon. I knew I couldn't fight them physically, not at my age, but I also knew I absolutely could not let them take this notebook. If they found it, they would destroy it, burn it, make it disappear. And Marcus would be dead by sunset tomorrow. I took a deep, shaking breath and retreated into the shadows behind the stack of protein powder containers. I needed a plan, and I had maybe 10 seconds before they forced their way through that door. The door handle began rattling violently as someone outside prepared to break it open. The metal groaned in protest, and the door started lifting, revealing wet black boots and the barrels of flashlights. I was trapped, and the deadly game of cat and mouse had just turned into a desperate fight for survival. I pressed my spine flat against the freezing cold corrugated steel wall of the storage unit, holding my breath as a beam of the security guard's flashlight swept across the concrete floor just inches from where I stood hidden in shadow. The heavy boots crunched on gravel outside, and I knew I had maybe seconds before they stepped fully inside and discovered me. I'm 74 years old. I can't fight a man half my age in hand-to-hand combat, but I had something they didn't have. I knew this facility inside and out. 10 years ago, when Marcus first rented this unit to store his startup company files and old equipment, I'd come here with him to help repair the back perimeter fence that had been knocked down during a severe windstorm. I remembered a loose section of chain-link fence, exactly 3 rows behind Unit 319. It was a small gap hidden by overgrown weeds and bushes, a shortcut the neighborhood kids used to sneak in and out without paying. I waited, barely breathing, until the guard took a step toward the table of chemicals, his attention focused completely on the white powder and the scale. In that split second of distraction, I moved. I didn't run, because running makes noise that would give away my position. I slid silently out of the shadows and slipped through the narrow gap between the partially open door and the metal frame, moving out into the pouring rain. The storm was my ally now, my cover. The thunder drowned out the sound of my footsteps on the wet pavement. I kept my head down, clutching the notebook and the sample of poison against my chest beneath my coat to keep them dry and protected. I navigated the maze of identical storage unit doors by pure memory, counting rows until I reached the back perimeter fence. My hands were shaking violently as I pulled back the rusted wire mesh. It scraped against my skin, drawing blood, but I didn't feel any pain. Adrenaline had taken over completely. I squeezed my body through the narrow gap and tumbled onto the muddy embankment on the other side, landing hard on my hip. My car was parked a full block away, hidden in shadows. I fumbled desperately with my keys, my fingers numb from cold and fear. As the engine roared to life, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the flashlights of the guards still searching inside the fence perimeter. They were looking in the wrong direction. I was already gone. I drove like a man possessed by demons. Speed limit signs blurred past in the rain. My destination was St. Michael's Private Hospital, the exclusive medical facility where Victoria had insisted Marcus receive all his treatment. It was 30 minutes away on a normal night, but I made it in 20, my foot pressed hard on the accelerator. My mind raced fast in the car, rehearsing exactly what I would say when I got there. I had the notebook with its damning entries. I had the physical sample of poison. I had the science and the expertise to back it up. Thallium is a heavy metal that mimics other diseases perfectly. It causes severe neuropathy, hair loss, confusion, and organ failure. The symptoms match what the doctors have been calling an autoimmune disorder with terrifying precision. Once I showed them the hard evidence, They would have no choice but to test Marcus immediately. They would have to start chelation therapy within the hour. I screeched into the emergency parking lot, leaving my car diagonal across 2 parking spaces. I didn't care about parking tickets or regulations. I marched through the sliding glass doors, dripping rainwater and mud everywhere, my eyes wild with panic and iron determination. The night receptionist looked up, visibly startled by this disheveled old man storming toward her desk like a hurricane. "Where's Marcus Cole?" I demanded, slamming my hand down on her counter hard enough to make her jump. "What room is my son in?" "Sir, you absolutely cannot just barge in here like this," she stammered, reaching nervously for her phone. "My son is dying," I shouted, my voice echoing to the pristine lobby. "He's in the VIP wing on the 4th floor, room 418. I'm going up there right now, and if you try to stop me, I will sue this hospital into bankruptcy." I didn't wait for her response or permission. I headed straight for the elevators, my wet shoes squeaking on the polished floor. I knew the room number because I'd memorized it from the one time Victoria had grudgingly allowed me to visit. The elevator ride felt like it lasted a lifetime. When the doors finally opened, I sprinted down the hallway as fast as my old legs would carry me. I burst through the door of room 418, and the sight that greeted me made my knees go weak. Marcus was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to monitors that beeped with a slow, disturbingly irregular rhythm. He looked even worse than he had at dinner just hours ago. His skin was the color of old parchment paper, and his breathing was so shallow I could barely see his chest moving. A nurse in blue scrubs was adjusting his foredrip with practiced efficiency. "Stop!" I yelled, rushing to his bedside. "Stop that for right now." The nurse jumped back, dropping the saline bag in shock. "Sir, you need to get out of here immediately or I'm calling security." I ignored her completely. I grabbed Marcus's shoulder, shaking him as gently as I could. "Marcus, can you hear me? It's Dad, it's Richard. Listen to me very carefully. Son, you're being poisoned. Do you understand? Poisoned." Marcus's eyelids fluttered weakly. He looked at me, but his eyes were glassy and completely unfocused, like he was looking through me rather than at me. "Dad," he mumbled, his words slurring badly. Why are you all wet?" I turned to the nurse, who was backing away toward the call button mounted on the wall. "Get the doctor in here immediately. Get a toxicology specialist. This man has thallium poisoning. Do you understand me? You need to run a complete heavy metal panel right now. This minute. Look at his fingernails." I grabbed Marcus's hand and held it up to the light. Look at the white lines across his nails. Those are Mies lines. It's a classic textbook sign of heavy metal toxicity. How could you people possibly miss this? The door flew open behind me with a bang. I turned, expecting hospital security, but instead it was Dr. Morrison, the head of the department and the physician Victoria trusted implicitly. He was a tall man with perfectly groomed silver hair and a condescending smile that made me want to punch him in his smug face. "Mr. Blackwell," Dr. Morrison said, his voice infuriatingly calm and patronizing, "please step away from the patient immediately. You're disrupting his treatment and causing his vital signs to spike." "Treatment?" I scoffed bitterly. "You're killing him with your incompetence. Look at this." I pulled the damp notebook from inside my coat and shoved it toward him forcefully. "This is a detailed log, Dr. Morrison, a systematic record of dosages. My daughter-in-law has been feeding him thallium for 3 solid months. That's why his liver enzymes are through the roof. That's why he can't walk or think straight. Test his blood. Do it right now." Dr. Morrison didn't even glance at the notebook I was holding out. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and barely concealed annoyance. "Richard, we discussed this multiple times already. Marcus has a complex autoimmune condition. His symptoms are completely consistent with that diagnosis. There is no poison involved. You're understandably distraught, and you're seeing conspiracies where there is only unfortunate biology." "Conspiracy?" I shouted. "I found a laboratory setup in his storage unit. I have a sample of the actual powder in my pocket right now. Test the powder. Just test it." I reached into my pocket to pull out the Ziploc bag containing the white powder I'd taken from the storage unit. But before I could withdraw it, a sharp voice cut through the room like a knife through butter. "Richard, stop it. Please, just stop this madness." I froze completely. I turned slowly toward the door, my heart sinking into my stomach. Victoria was standing there in the doorway. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood two massive uniformed security guards and a man in an expensive gray suit carrying a leather briefcase. Victoria was crying. Real tears streamed down her cheeks, ruining her perfect makeup. She looked utterly devastated, like a grieving wife being tormented by a delusional, dangerous old man. "Oh, Dr. Morrison, I am so sorry about this," she sobbed dramatically, walking over to the doctor and clutching his arm for support. "I tried so hard to keep him away. He's been getting progressively worse lately. The dementia, the paranoia. He calls me at all hours of the night, accusing me of absolutely horrible things. I didn't know what else to do." I stared at her with my mouth hanging open in complete disbelief. The performance was absolutely flawless, Oscar-worthy. "Dementia," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I don't have dementia, Victoria. I have your murder journal." Victoria looked at the notebook in my trembling hand, then back at the doctor with sad, pleading eyes. "That's my personal workout journal, Dr. Morrison. I use it to track my protein shakes and gym routine meal planning. He stole it from my bag at the house. He thinks protein powder is poison. He's confused and paranoid." Dr. Morrison nodded sympathetically, placing a reassuring hand on Victoria's shoulder. "I completely understand, Victoria. It's incredibly difficult watching a parent decline mentally while your husband is fighting for his life. You're remarkably brave to handle both situations." 9:26 a.m. I felt the entire room spinning around me. They were rewriting reality right in front of my eyes. The gaslighting was so complete, so confident and well-rehearsed, that for a terrifying split second, even I questioned my own sanity. But then I looked at Marcus lying in that bed. I saw the measly lines across his fingernails. I smelled the faint metallic odor coming from his skin. I knew the science. Science doesn't lie. People lie. Test him. I begged, my voice breaking with desperation. Just run one test. If I'm wrong, if I'm completely insane, lock me up in a psychiatric ward. But if I'm right, you'll save his life. What possible harm is there in running one simple test? Dr. Morrison sighed deeply and shook his head with finality. "Mr. Blackwell, I cannot and will not order invasive medical tests based on the delusions of a grieving father. It's unethical, and it causes unnecessary stress to my patient. Security, please escort him out of the building." The two massive guards stepped forward. They were mountains of solid muscle. One of them grabbed my arm with a grip like an iron vice. "Let go of me," I growled, trying desperately to pull away. "I'm not leaving him alone with her. She's going to kill him." "Richard, please stop fighting," Victoria cried out, covering her face with her hands dramatically. "You're frightening Marcus. Look at him." I looked at the bed. Marcus was visibly agitated now, his heart monitor beeping faster and faster. He looked terrified, but not at Victoria. He was looking at me, at his father screaming and covered in mud and rain, acting like a complete lunatic. "Dad, just go home," Marcus whispered weakly, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes. "Please, just go home." That broke me. It shattered my heart into a million pieces. My own son, my flesh and blood, thought I was a villain in this nightmare. The guards dragged me backward. I dug my heels into the polished floor, but I was no match for their strength. They hauled me out of the room, down the long hallway, past staring nurses and shocked visitors, into the elevator. People stared at me as I was dragged past them, just another crazy old man ranting about poison and conspiracy theories. They threw me out onto the wet pavement outside the hospital entrance. I landed hard on my hip, white-hot pain shooting up my entire spine. I lay there in the cold rain, the water mixing with tears of pure frustration streaming down my face. Before I could even attempt to stand up, the man in the gray suit stepped out of the building. He held an umbrella over his perfectly dry head and looked down at me with cold, completely indifferent eyes. "Mr. Blackwell," he said formally, extending a folded piece of paper toward me. "I'm Victoria's personal attorney. This is an emergency temporary restraining order, granted by a judge this evening, regarding your harassment and credible threats of violence." I stared at the paper, rainwater making the ink blur slightly, but the words were still crystal clear. "You are hereby ordered to stay at least 100 yards away from Marcus Cole, Victoria Cole, and their minor son Oliver Cole. Any violation of this order will result in your immediate arrest and criminal prosecution." The lawyer dropped the paper onto my soaking wet chest like it was contaminated garbage. "Go home, old man," he said coldly, "before you spend your retirement years rotting in a jail cell." He turned and walked back into the warm, safe hospital, leaving me completely alone in the storm. I watched the automatic door slide shut, sealing my son inside with his murderer. I had the evidence in my hands. I had the truth burning in my mind, but I had absolutely no power to act on it. And tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow, Marcus would sign his entire life away to Victoria. And then he would die, just like she'd planned all along. I sat up slowly in that cold puddle on the pavement, clutching the restraining order in my shaking hands. My hip throbbed with pain. My pride was completely destroyed. But as I looked up at that fourth-floor window where the light from room 418 glowed in the darkness, I felt something else entirely replace the crushing despair. Rage. Pure, cold, calculating rage. They thought they'd won because they had the law on their side. They thought I was just a helpless, confused old man. But they forgot one critical thing about me. I was a scientist. And in science, when an experiment fails catastrophically, you don't just quit and give up. You change the variables. You adapt. You find another way. I stood up slowly, painfully, wiping mud from my hands. I limped back toward my car, my mind already working through the problem like a complex equation. I couldn't go back to the hospital. I couldn't approach the police yet, not with this restraining order hanging over my head like a guillotine. I needed help. I needed someone who operated outside the rigid lines that Victoria had drawn so carefully around my family. I reached for my phone with trembling fingers and dialed a number I hadn't called in 20 years. A number belonging to a man who owed me a life debt from our days working together in corporate toxicology. A man who knew how to make things happen when the official channels failed. "Maxwell," I said when a gravelly voice answered on the third ring. "It's Richard. I'm calling to collect on that favor you owe me. And bring your absolute best forensic team. We have a war to start, and we're running out of time." I drove home in a complete daze, the rhythmic thumping of windshield wipers measuring out precious seconds of my life slipping away. My hip throbbed where I'd hit the pavement outside the hospital, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to cold, suffocating fear wrapped around my heart. I pulled into my driveway, headlights sweeping across the empty, dark windows of my house. It looked like a mausoleum. Too big, too quiet, filled with memories of a life that felt like it belonged to a complete stranger. I didn't go to the kitchen to make tea. I didn't collapse in my recliner to weep. I went straight to the heavy oak door in the hallway that led down to my basement laboratory. I unlocked it, and the smell of musty air and old chemicals rose up to greet me like an old friend. This was my sanctuary, my domain. This was where I kept the remnants of Richard Blackwell, the scientist. Not Richard Blackwell, the retired old man everyone dismissed. I flipped the light switch, and fluorescent lights flickered to life overhead, humming with electrical energy. The basement was exactly as I'd left it years ago when I retired. My old workbench ran the entire length of the far wall, covered in a thick layer of gray dust. Beakers, test tubes, and Erlenmeyer flasks sat on metal shelves like forgotten soldiers waiting for orders. When I'd retired from the pharmaceutical company, I'd kept a small personal lab set up, mostly for testing soil samples from my garden or checking water quality in the local creek. I never imagined in my worst nightmares that I'd be using it to investigate the attempted murder of my own son. I took off my soaking wet coat and threw it on a chair. I rolled up my sleeves, ignoring the cold that had seeped into my bones. My hands were shaking, but not from age this time. from pure rage. I forced myself to take a long, deep breath. Emotion is the enemy of good science. I needed to be cold, clinical, precise. I needed proof that would stand up in any court of law. I pulled the Ziploc bag containing the gray powder from my pocket and placed it carefully on the black slate countertop. It looked so innocent lying there, just a small amount of dust. But I knew that in the right dosage, this tiny amount could stop a human heart dead. I grabbed a clean rag and methodically wiped down my workspace, clearing away years of accumulated neglect. I reached into the storage cabinet and pulled out my old reagent kit. Some of the chemicals were old, but acids and bases don't expire. They're sealed and stored correctly. I found a bottle of hydrochloric acid and a container of potassium iodide. My heart beat a steady, determined rhythm against my ribs as I lit the Bunsen burner. The blue flame hissed to life, and that familiar sound brought me right back to my 40 years in a laboratory. I took a small metal spatula and carefully transferred a few milligrams of the gray powder into a clean test tube. I added distilled water and watched closely as it dissolved. It disappeared instantly, leaving the water perfectly clear. That was my first confirmation. Complete solubility. A poison that leaves absolutely no visible trace in a drink or liquid food. Next came the acidification test. I added several drops of hydrochloric acid and held the tube up to the light, swirling it gently in my hand. No reaction whatsoever. Good. That definitively ruled out silver compounds and lead. Now for the definitive test, the one that would confirm my worst fears. I needed to test specifically for thallium. Thallium is known in toxicology circles as the poisoner's poison. It was Saddam Hussein's weapon of choice against political enemies. It was used extensively by Soviet assassins during the Cold War. It's completely tasteless, utterly odorless, and dissolves perfectly in water or any liquid. In the human body, it chemically substitutes itself for potassium, systematically attacking the nervous system and the cardiovascular system. It destroys you slowly from the inside out while making you look like you're just naturally fading away from illness. I took a platinum wire loop and dipped it carefully into the solution. I moved my hand slowly toward the blue flame of the Bunsen burner. My breath caught in my throat. This was the absolute moment of truth. If the flame turned red, it was lithium. If it turned violet, it was potassium. But if my terrible suspicion was correct, I thrust the wire directly into the hottest part of the blue flame. Instantly, the fire changed color. It didn't turn red. It didn't turn violet. It flared a brilliant, unmistakable emerald green. I stared at that green flame, completely mesmerized by its deadly beauty. It was the color of envy, the color of money, the color of the poison coursing through Marcus's veins at that very moment. Thallium, confirmed beyond any shadow of doubt. I turned off the gas supply, and the green flame vanished instantly, leaving me standing in the humming silence of the basement. I slumped onto a metal stool, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. It was no longer a hypothesis or theory. It was established scientific fact. Victoria was systematically feeding Marcus thallium sulfate, probably derived from old rat poison or a legally imported pesticide. The careful dosage schedule in her notebook made perfect, horrible sense now. The first week caused crushing fatigue and disorientation. The second week attacked the peripheral nerves in his legs, causing progressive paralysis. And the massive dose she had planned for Friday night would cause a fatal myocardial infarction, a catastrophic heart attack. And because Dr. Morrison was absolutely convinced it was an autoimmune disease, there would be no autopsy performed. Marcus would be cremated within days, and every trace of evidence would disappear into smoke and ash. I looked at the test tube in my hand, still glowing faintly in the dim light. I had irrefutable scientific proof right here. But as the adrenaline slowly faded from my system, the crushing reality of my situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I had broken into a storage unit. I had stolen this sample, completely destroying the chain of custody. If I walked into a police station right now with this test tube, any competent defense attorney would tear my case to shreds. They would argue I planted it. They would claim I contaminated it. They would paint me as a senile old man who'd fabricated evidence in his own basement laboratory to frame his daughter-in-law, because he was jealous of her control over the family fortune and company. I rubbed my face roughly with both hands, feeling days of stubble on my chin. I was a scientist, and I had solved the deadly equation, but I had completely failed at the politics and legal maneuvering. I knew exactly who the killer was. I knew precisely what the murder weapon was, but I was utterly powerless to stop the execution scheduled for tomorrow night. A sudden vibration in my pocket shattered my dark thoughts. I jumped, nearly knocking over the entire rack of test tubes. I pulled out my phone, and the name on the screen made my heart stop completely. Oliver. My grandson wasn't supposed to have access to his phone at night. Victoria always confiscated it at exactly 8 o'clock. He must be using his iPad, hidden under his blankets, connecting through the house Wi-Fi. I opened the message, and the words chill me to my very core, colder than the rain outside. Mom just changed the combination to the safe in Dad's office. I heard all the beeps through the wall. She's in the kitchen right now. She's mixing something loud in the blender. She told me to go to bed early because Dad needs special medicine tonight to be strong enough for tomorrow's signing. Grandpa, I'm scared. I read the message twice, my hands gripping the phone, so hard I thought the screen might shatter. Special medicine. That was it. The final 50-milligram dose she'd written about in her journal. She wasn't waiting for tomorrow night after all. She was accelerating her timeline, moving up the murder. Maybe my scene at the hospital had spooked her badly. Maybe she realized I was getting too close to the truth, and she decided to finish it tonight, before I could interfere again. If Marcus drank that poison smoothie, he would be dead before the sun came up. He would never make it to the document signing. But she probably had a backup plan for that scenario too. Some story about him dying peacefully in his sleep after heroically trying to get his affairs in order. I looked at the clock on the basement wall. 9:45 at night. I texted back frantically, my fingers flying across the screen. Oliver, listen to me very carefully. Do not let your father drink that. Do you understand? Spill it. Knock it over. Break the glass. Do anything you have to do. I watched the 3 little dots dance on the screen as he typed his response. The suspense was absolutely agonizing, each second feeling like an hour. I can't, Grandpa. She locked his bedroom door from the outside. She has a key on a chain around her neck. She's taking the drink up to him right now. I'm really, really scared. I stare at my phone screen, that green flame from the thallium test still burning bright in my memory. The restraining order sat in my car outside. If I called the police, they would take at least 20 minutes to arrive, maybe longer in this weather. And they would probably arrest me for violating the court order before they even bothered to check on Marcus. Logic told me to call 911 immediately. Logic told me to call my attorney Maxwell. But logic takes precious time, and Marcus didn't have time left. He had minutes, maybe less. I put the phone in my pocket and grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from my tool bench. I didn't have a carefully thought-out plan. I just knew with absolute certainty that I was not going to let my son die while I sat on hold with an emergency dispatcher or waited for lawyers to argue jurisdiction. I ran up the basement stairs, taking them 2 at a time despite my age, ignoring the screaming pain shooting through my injured hip. I burst out into the hallway and grabbed my car keys from the hook. Victoria wanted a villain? She wanted a dangerous, crazy old man who was a threat to her perfect family? Well, tonight, I was going to give her exactly what she'd been telling everyone I was. I was going back to that house. And this time, I wasn't politely knocking on the front door and waiting for permission. I drove through those rain-soaked streets like a demon possessed, my headlights cutting through the darkness, every traffic light feeling like a personal insult. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles had gone completely white, bloodless. The iron pry bar sat on the passenger seat next to me, cold and heavy. I wasn't thinking about consequences anymore. I wasn't worried about restraining orders or lawyers, or what the neighbors might think. The only thing burning in my mind was the image of Marcus lifting that poisoned glass to his lips while Victoria stood over him with that sickeningly sweet smile. I screeched into their driveway at exactly 10:07. The house was mostly dark, except for a single light glowing in the upstairs master bedroom window. Marcus's room. My heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to break free. I grabbed the pry bar and ran toward the house, my shoes splashing through puddles. I didn't go to the front door. I went straight around the side of the kitchen entrance, the one with the old lock I'd helped Marcus install years ago when they first bought this place. The lock was still the same cheap hardware store deadbolt. 3 solid hits with a pry bar, and the door frame splintered like kindling. The door swung open with a crash that echoed through the silent house. I didn't try to be quiet anymore. Stealth was pointless now. Victoria. I roared, my voice filling every corner of that house. Get away from him. Get away from my son. I heard a scream from upstairs, high-pitched and startled. Good. Let her be afraid for once. I took the stairs as fast as my old legs could carry me, my hips screaming in agony with every step. But I didn't care. Pain meant I was still alive. Pain meant I could still fight. The master bedroom door was closed, and I could hear Victoria's voice on the other side, muffled but frantic. Richard, you're violating a court order. I'm calling the police right now. You'll go to prison for this. I didn't waste time arguing. I raised the pry bar and jammed it between the door and the frame. One massive heave, and the lock broke clean through. The door flew open and slammed against the wall with a thunderous bang. The scene before me was exactly what I feared. Marcus was propped up against pillows in the massive bed, looking like a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead yet. His eyes were glazed, unfocused, his mouth hanging slightly open, and there on the nightstand beside him was a tall glass filled with thick, pale liquid, the protein shake. The final dose. Victoria stood next to the bed, her phone pressed against her ear, her face twisted with rage and something else, fear. Real fear. The police are on their way, Richard, she hissed. You just destroyed your entire life for nothing. I ignored her completely. I lunged toward the nightstand and grabbed that glass, my hand closing around it just as Marcus's trembling fingers reached for it. No. Victoria shrieked, diving toward me, but I was faster. I hurled that glass across the room with every ounce of strength I had. It shattered against the far wall, and thick, creamy liquid splattered everywhere, dripping down the expensive wallpaper like toxic rain. Victoria stared at the mess, her face going absolutely white. For just a second, her mask slipped completely, and I saw the truth written all over her features. Pure, undiluted panic. She just watched her perfect murder weapon destroyed right before her eyes. You crazy old man, she whispered, but her voice was shaking now. That was his medicine, his protein supplement the doctor specifically prescribed. Liar, I said quietly, my voice deadly calm. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small vial containing a sample of the gray powder. I held it up to the light. This is thallium sulfate, Victoria. I tested it myself in my laboratory. The same poison you've been feeding him for 3 months. The same poison you documented in your journal. Her eyes went wide, staring at the vial like it was a venomous snake about to strike. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, backing away slowly. You're having delusions, Richard. You need psychiatric help. Then explain the storage unit, I said, taking a step toward her. Explain the digital scale. Explain the boxes of latex gloves. Explain the journal with your handwriting documenting every single dose. The color drained completely from her face. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Behind me, I heard a small voice, barely a whisper. Grandpa. I turned. Oliver was standing in the doorway, still in his pajamas, his eyes enormous with fear and something else. Hope. Desperate, fragile hope. Oliver, get back to your room right now. Victoria snapped, tried to regain control, but Oliver didn't move. He looked at his mother, then at me, then at his father lying helpless in the bed. She's been putting something in Dad's food, Oliver said, his voice trembling but clear. I've seen her. Late at night when she thinks I'm asleep. She measures it out with gloves on, mixing it into his protein shakes. Victoria's face went from white to crimson. Oliver, you have no idea what you're saying. You're just a confused child." "I'm not confused, Mom," Oliver said, and I heard his voice break. "I know what I saw. I've been writing it down, just like you taught me to keep records. Every date, every time I saw you do it." Tears were streaming down his face now, but he stood his ground. "Tell me in the comments. And if you've dealt with something similar, share your story. You're not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life." The sound of sirens cut through the night air, growing louder with each passing second. Red and blue lights began flashing to the bedroom windows, painting the walls in alternating colors of emergency. Victoria's eyes darted toward the window, calculating her next move. I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how to spin this, how to make herself the victim again. But before she could say anything, Marcus stirred. His hand moved slowly, reaching toward me. "Dad," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "Dad, she won't let me stop drinking." Those words hung in the air like a confession from beyond the grave. The police burst through the front door downstairs. I heard boots pounding up the stairs, voices shouting commands. I turned to Victoria one last time. "It's over," I said simply. 2 officers appeared in the doorway, hands on their weapons, taking in the scene with sharp, trained eyes. He broke into my house. Victoria cried immediately, pointing at me with shaking finger. "He has a restraining order. He attacked us." But one of the officers, a young woman with keen eyes, was looking at Marcus in the bed. She moved closer, and I saw her expression change as she noticed the shattered glass on the wall. The way Marcus was staring at Victoria with undisguised terror. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the bed," the officer said calmly but firmly. "This is ridiculous." Victoria protested. "I'm the victim here." The second officer spoke into his radio. "We need an ambulance at this location immediately. Possible poisoning case." Those 2 words, poisoning case, made Victoria's entire body go rigid. I pulled the journal from inside my jacket and handed it directly to the female officer. "This documents everything," I said. "Every dose, every symptom, every calculated step of attempted murder. And I have physical evidence of thallium in my car, tested and confirmed in my laboratory." The officer took the journal carefully, flipping through the pages. Her expression grew darker with each entry she read. "Mrs. Cole," she said, her voice now official and cold, "I need you to come with us to the station to answer some questions. I'm not going anywhere without my lawyer." Victoria shrieked, her composure finally shattering completely. "That's absolutely your right, ma'am," the officer replied, "but you're still coming with us." As they led Victoria out of the room, she looked back at Marcus one final time, and the hatred in her eyes was so intense it made my blood freeze. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was personal. This was rage at being caught, at being outsmarted by the old man she dismissed as senile and irrelevant. The paramedics arrived and immediately began checking Marcus's vital signs, asking him questions, starting in 4-line. I heard them mention chelation therapy, heavy metal screening, intensive care. Oliver ran to me and wrapped his arms around my waist, sobbing into my chest. I held him tight, stroking his hair with shaking hands. "You were so brave," I whispered. "So incredibly brave." I was scared she'd hurt him. Oliver cried. I didn't know what to do. "You did exactly the right thing," I said. "You saved your father's life by trusting me." The next 72 hours were a blur of police interviews, medical tests, and lawyers. The chelation therapy began immediately, pumping chemicals into Marcus's bloodstream that would bind to the thallium and help his body eliminate it before it caused permanent damage. The storage unit was searched and processed as a crime scene. Every item was cataloged, photographed, analyzed. The journal was entered into evidence. My laboratory test results were reviewed by the state forensic toxicologist, who confirmed my findings completely. Victoria was arrested and charged with attempted murder, fraud, and endangering the welfare of a child. The bail was set at $2 million, which she couldn't make even with all the money she'd already stolen. Marcus's recovery was slow, agonizingly slow. The doctor said if I'd arrived even 30 minutes later, That final dose would have stopped his heart permanently. But gradually, day by day, I watched the color return to his skin. I watched the confusion clear from his eyes. I watched him remember who he was. 3 weeks after that terrible night, I sat beside his hospital bed, and he was finally able to hold a real conversation. I kept trying to tell myself it was just a disease, Marcus said quietly, staring at his hands. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I couldn't believe she would actually do that to me. She counted on that, I said. She counted on your trust, on everyone's trust. Marcus looked at me with tears in his eyes. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I'm sorry I told you to leave. I squeezed his hand gently. You were being poisoned. Your mind wasn't your own. There's nothing to forgive. Oliver came to visit every day after school. Slowly, carefully, the three of us began building something new from the wreckage Victoria had left behind. A real family, based on truth instead of lies. The trial took 8 months. The evidence was overwhelming. Victoria's own journal condemned her in her own handwriting. The forensic analysis of the protein powder showed lethal concentrations of thallium sulfate. Oliver's testimony, delivered with heartbreaking honesty, destroyed any remaining doubt. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Victoria was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. I was sitting in the courtroom when they read the verdict. I watched her face as the reality of her future crashed down on her. She looked at me across that courtroom, and for just a moment, I saw something other than hatred in her eyes. I saw defeat. Marcus made a full recovery, though the doctor said some nerve damage might be permanent. The tremors in his hands eventually stopped. The confusion cleared. His company went public 6 months later, making him one of the wealthiest men in Seattle, just like he'd always dreamed. But money didn't matter to him anymore. Not the way it used to. He spent his time with Oliver, teaching him the code, taking him fishing, being present in a way he'd never been before. And every Sunday, the three of us had dinner together. Real dinner, where we talked and laughed and remembered how close we came to losing everything. I'm 75 now, a year older than when this nightmare began. My hip still aches when it rains, a permanent reminder that night. I broke down a door to save my son's life. But I don't regret a single moment. People ask me sometimes how I knew, how I was so certain when everyone else believed the lies. And I tell them the truth. I knew because I never stopped looking. I never stopped questioning. I never accepted the easy answer when my gut told me something was wrong. Science taught me to trust evidence over emotion, but it was love, fierce, protective, unbreakable love, that gave me the courage to act when the evidence demanded it. If you're reading this and something feels wrong in your life, if someone you love is changing in ways that don't make sense, if your instincts are screaming that something terrible is happening even though everyone tells you you're crazy, trust yourself. Investigate. Question everything. Don't let anyone gaslight you into ignoring what you know in your bones to be true. I almost lost my son because I was traveling, because I wasn't paying attention, because I trusted the wrong person. But I got a second chance. Not everyone does. So I'm telling you this story not just as a warning about the monsters that hide behind smiling faces. I'm telling you this as a reminder that you are stronger than you think, braver than you know, and sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to give up when everyone tells you to walk away. Marcus is alive today because I didn't give up, because Oliver didn't give up, because we chose to believe in the evidence even when the whole world said we were wrong. And that's a choice any of us can make at any age in any situation. Choose truth. Choose courage. Choose to fight for the people you love, even when it costs you everything. Because in the end, what else is there?